Let's see, today is May 20th, 2012. It's Sunday morning. It's about 6:20 a.m. My grandson, I took the trash. You know, when I go outside, I even go into the trash container. I take my cell phone with me, and in my pocket I take my Canon C12. I went out, threw the trash in, and we're in a gated apartment complex here. My grandson came out behind me. He had to go catch the bus to go to work, and I wish he wouldn't do it, but the there's a passenger or an entrance for for people, but it's down at the other end of the apartment complex at the entrance gate. At the exit gate, there's one of those doors, but it's chained up and doesn't work. So when you want to, if you're walking, you got to. Anyway, my grandson has been scaling the exit gate. He just goes over it like a Navy SEAL or something. And I was out there, and then I saw him, and I thought, okay, I'm going to get a picture of this. And I pulled my Canon, but it was very dark, and I have I always say ASA, but ISO set to 800 or something. And so I took a picture of him as he was heading towards the gate, and it took a little bit to process, and he was already over the gate and gone. So I wanted to get a picture of him going over the gate, but I wish he wouldn't do that. He's half black. Somebody might shoot him. Just kidding, I hope. Wanted to talk about obituaries. When I was a kid, my parents. By the way, my father and mother. I never called my father and mother mom and dad or father and mother. I always call them Jim and Betty. I've blogged about that a few times, and I've asked people, anybody else? Did that go on in your life? And I don't think I've gotten any comments, so I guess it didn't. I have no idea. The only time I would say mother and father would be if I was talking, like if I was I always went to Catholic schools. If I was at Catholic grade school or whatever, and it was Friday, my mother was a Protestant back then. And on Friday, she would forget all the time and send me a bologna sandwich or something. And the other kids, today's Friday. So I wouldn't say, Betty made it for me. I'd say, well, my mother forgot, or But other than that, I always, of course, my parents have passed away now. I always referred to my father as Jim and my mother as Betty. For a couple years, when I was like in the second and third grade or whatever, my mother's mother lived with us, and I called her Mom. So now her name was Hallie. No wonder, Wanted to talk about obituaries. My mother and father, when I was young, every morning when they got the newspaper. Now, if these videos stick around after I'm gone, somebody's got to put a footnote explaining what newspapers are. I got a feeling, somebody please put a footnote and explain what a newspaper is. My father would get the morning paper, and then they'd be having breakfast, and they would read the obituary column every morning and talk about, so I thought that was really strange. Now I do it. I go to kansascity.com, and I try to remember to go and check the obituaries. I may not do it every day, but then you can click and do it for the last 3 days or 5 days or something like that, I think. And so I try to do it. This morning I went there, and two people that I knew had passed away. Their obituaries were there. One was a doctor from St. Joseph Hospital, Dr. Elliott, and I mean, I saw him just about every day. I worked at St. Joe Hospital for 3.5 years, from 1972 to, I don't know, 1975 or something like that. So I saw him about every day, and I said, "Good morning, doctor. Good afternoon, doctor," or "Doctor, the switchboard is looking for you." But anyway, I read his obituary. I mean, he was a really nice guy. He was a good doctor, and he was a really nice, friendly guy. I saw his obituary there, at the site, and I read it. And of course, I didn't know. That's the thing. All these people that I worked with or knew, I didn't know anything about their personal lives usually, and so kind of interesting. You read this and see, the guy was in the military and was in combat and so forth and so on. Really interesting. Now the other obituary, Mr. Vernon R. Johnson, he was the director of Human Resources, Personnel Department at Trinity Lutheran Hospital, and I worked there for 5.5 or 6 years. So from 1975 to 1980 or something. And like I said, he was the head of the personnel department. And during the time that I was working, I worked hospital security and safety. And my boss, the director of security and safety, I liked him and he liked me. But I also had problems with him. And he was a really smart man when it came to paperwork or when it came to that, but when it came to dealing with people, and the guy, the director of security I'm talking about now, he'd been a colonel in the United States Army, and you would think, somebody who was a officer in the military would know how to handle people. Maybe he knew how to handle. I don't think so. Maybe he knew how to handle them in the military, but he didn't know in civilian life how to handle them. So even though he liked me, and even though he promoted me, and even though that director gave me fantastic merit reviews, unbelievable merit reviews, raved about me, I had problems with him. And when I had problems with him, then he had problems with me. And so I did the grievance procedure 4 times at Trinity Lutheran Hospital. And of course, when I filled out the grievance form, the first step went to personnel, to Mr. Johnson. And then he got the paperwork and he did a little investigation or whatever. Then my first meeting would be with the director of security. Then my next meeting would be with, Mr. Johnson. And then next meeting would go to administration or whatever. So I did 4 grievances, and I won all 4 of them. And I got to know Mr. Johnson really well. And we talked about a lot of things, and he was a really fair man, and a just man, and that was really my first contact with, when I was a welder. I mean, they had a personnel, worked at KW Dart Truck Company for several years as a welder, and that was a big place, and the director of personnel there, he knew everybody's name. I mean, there must have been thousands. There was a lot of employees. I don't know how many, but and he knew their names. But and I had some dealings with the director of personnel, or at the first hospital I worked at, St. Joe. But with Mr. Johnson, he was really fair. He was really just, and I see now from his obituary here that he was. I knew he was. We kind of laughed about it. He'd been I think it was 20 years. He was a engineer or a fireman or something on with a railroad, and so. attendance and punctuality were really important. And he comes over as director of course, there's other, went to school and all this kind of stuff. But then he came over and ended up director. And boy, if you had good attendance and punctuality, that was, if you didn't, you had two strikes against you. And there was no, it was when he had meetings or whatever, with employees or whatever, he'd say, I worked for the railroad, and I had to leave if it's snowing. I had to leave in order to get to the train to do it. If I had to leave 12 hours early or 18 hours early to get to my shift, I did, And it was kind of funny, because the first grievance, I'm just going to talk about the one grievance. Anyway, I found that Mr. Johnson was really fair, really just, and later on, after I left Trinity Lutheran Hospital, I went to another hospital, Research Medical Center, and I did 2 grievances there. And the first grievance, the asshole supervisor that I had in the department, he caved in. He tried to be a macho, kick-ass, guy in the office, called me into his office or whatever. I cut him to pieces, and he gave up right there. But I'm sure if it had gone to, he didn't want it to go to any place. He was scared. He's scared his entire life. If he's still alive, he's still scared. But I did a second grievance with Research Hospital, and I lost it big time. And they didn't even pretend, the personnel department didn't even pretend to try to make you think that the grievance procedure worked and that it was fair in any way at all. It was like, administration wants this, and, fuck you, or whatever. And so, and one way, too, that I know, well, of course, I knew Mr. Johnson. You could just tell he was fair and just and professional. Just before I left Trinity, I went down to the personnel department. I said, I'd like to see my personnel file. And Mr. Johnson said, okay, Jim. He says, one of our people will have to sit with you, while you make, I said, fine, and pulled the file out. And there wasn't anything in that file that I didn't know about. I thought, there might be little, if it had been left up to my director of security, and he might have had a file on me, but not the official personnel file. But other places, there might be a file someplace, and it has, this guy's an asshole, this guy's an agitator, whatever. And I wasn't sure what would be, I wasn't expecting anything like that. But there wasn't anything in my personnel file there that I didn't know about, except there were 4 reports at Mr. Johnson when I did my grievances that he had made that I had never seen. And so then I read those, and he was fair, honest, and and I was surprised. And as an example, let me mention the first grievance that I did. The director of security at the hospital, I liked him, actually, and he liked me. But one thing was, I discovered was, when he wanted something, he was going to do whatever was necessary to get it. Lie, anything. I mean, he was going to get, he'd call it getting his ducks in line, but it was lying, anything. He was going to win. That was the way he worked. And then, too, he didn't know how, like I said, he didn't know how to handle people, which is surprising. And I ended up being a supervisor at the hospital, and I was, for some reason, really good at handling people. When I worked at Trinity, they had 2 different times, they had courses set up for supervisors. And I went to these courses for the supervisors, and everybody else there was, nursing RNs, supervisors or whatever. And when we'd take a break, the nurses would be saying, "Oh man, I just learned so much," and I was thinking, I didn't learn anything at all. I mean, it was, how participatory management, stuff like, and it just came natural to me that, you know, let your employees know what the goals are and what what you're trying to achieve, and get input from them and listen to them and try to work things out, you know, and I just did all those things, and the director of security could not do that. So I was departmental training officer and fire marshal and everything went really well. When he and he learned to, you know, let me do that, and he did the grand planning and stuff most of the time. But as an example, let me the first grievance that I did, I went into the security officer at Trinity Lutheran Hospital, and the director of security, he would write in red and post it on the bulletin board. From now, and this one was, from now on, anytime an employee is sick, even for one day, you have to have a doctor's excuse. So I read that. Okay. So I went out in the hall and then ran into him. I said, Mr. Ross, I said, he said, that doesn't apply to you, Jim. He says, your attendance is 100% excellent. He says, that's because of, forget his name, midnight shift supervisor. When it snows, he doesn't want to come in and do snow removal, and it's because of him. And I said, Mr. Ross, I said, what you need to do is you need to call him in. You know, explain to him that you have noticed that he calls in sick or whatever, and that there's a pattern, and that from now on he has to have a doctor's excuse. I said, but you can't do it for the entire department. And of course, I can do any goddamn thing I want in my department. I run this goddamn department, and you're not telling me what to do. If you don't like it, you can get out of this department. And I said, Mr. Ross, you need to take that down. I said, or else I'm going to do a grievance. And I had never done a grievance I'd never done a grievance before. Never done a grievance at that hospital or any place else. You just go ahead and do that goddamn grievance. And he took off, you know. Well, I found out from years later, going and looking at my personnel file, that he went right down to the personnel department and went in there and went to Mr. Vernon Johnson and told Mr. Johnson, because Mr. Johnson wrote this up, Jim Howard has been missing work, and I posted a thing on the bulletin board, and he told me, and Mr. Johnson said, no, hospital policy is, you know, you cannot require employees after missing one day, you know. And he told him, I run my department. You know, Mr. Johnson said, no, you know, I am the director of human resources, and we have hospital policies, and hospital policies apply to everybody. Just because your guys are in uniform, just because your guys carry guns, the hospital policies apply to them just like everybody else in every other department. And, you know, the director, Mr. Roth, I'm not changing that policy. So, but when I saw this thing years later, you know, the director, Mr. Ross, the director of security, had told Mr. Johnson, Jim Howard is he's the biggest offender. And Mr. Johnson just pulled up my personnel record and said, he wrote in this when he did the report, you know, he wrote in that he told Mr. Ross that hospital policy, you know, and he said, I checked Mr. Howard's attendance and it's excellent, exemplary. And for Mr. Johnson to say that was something. And so, anyway, for this grievance, then I had to go the next step. You know, I wrote up the grievance and turned it in. And then Mr. Johnson got it. Of course, he again I got a grievance from Jim Howard, and Mr. Ross said, this is my department or whatever. And Mr. Johnson said, no, you know, and this is my, you know. So then I had to go before Mr. Ross, and same thing, you know, you can't, you know, no, I can do any goddamn thing I want in my department or whatever. Of course, I didn't know that Mr. Johnson had told him, no, you can't, you know, at that point. And so then the next step was I had to go down to personnel department and sit down and then that's when Mr. Johnson told me, Jim, I told him he just doesn't understand that this isn't the military, and he needs to learn that this is civilian life. But, you know, And I said, no problem. I just, go to the next step. I signed off that I was not happy with this step, and I went to which was administration. So administration, of course, ordered the director of personnel to rescind the policy and to put a note up on the bulletin board saying, I posted, and that is not, and hospital policy is not as long, it does not comply with hospital policy. And then, of course, Mr. Johnson had to be up in the office when I got called in and told that I had won the grievance and that, whatever. And the director of security, his face was so red, blood vessels were just throbbing on his head, and Mr. Johnson had to sit there I don't know what the director of personnel, I don't know what the director of security, Mr. Ross, would have done if the director of personnel hadn't been there, hadn't been there with him. I don't know what he would have done. But anyway, that shows you, like I said later, I think I said, did I say that I later used a research medical center grievance procedure, and it was like, fuck you. You're an employee here. If your boss says kiss his ass, you kiss his ass. If administration says this is the way it's going to be, whether it's fair or not, that's the way it's going to be, fuck you. That was just their attitude. And they did try to hide it. And so Mr. Johnson, man, what a credit and what a pleasure it was actually working at Trinity Lutheran Hospital, knowing that there was somebody like that. I noticed that when he worked from his obituary here, by the way, he was a corpsman and on Okinawa, during World War II. He was a union, the head of the general chairman of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, so he was a union official during that time. And I think that explains it. And but it's so nice to work someplace and have somebody, and to know that there are people like that, and I think an organization does so much better if you have people like that in your organization. They're really, he worked, I was there from 75 to 80 or so. And I see here that he retired as head in January of 1992, so he was there a long time. Kind of wish I had known that he was, I even, later on, the hospital research medical center that I went to work for, and I went to work for them, they ended up forming a corporation, Health Midwest or whatever, and they took over 11 hospitals in the greater Kansas City area, and that was one of the hospitals. And I was actually sent down there to work for a few days when they needed somebody. And I wish I'd have looked up Mr. Johnson, and wish I'd have told him. I think he knew that I really admired him and respected him, and I found out later on that just goes to show you what an honest, decent man. And Trinity Lutheran Hospital was lucky to have him working there all those years. He was born in 1925, and he died a few days ago, May 17th, 2012. Really good, decent man. Thanks very much for watching.